we're going to travel back, not with a fancy time machine, but with our imaginations, to a time before stamps, before mailboxes, and even before the idea of a central post office existed. Picture yourself sitting in a small, windowless room carved from sun-baked mud bricks. The air is thick and smells of dust and something faintly sweet like crushed reeds, and you're painstakingly pressing a blunt stylus into it, making little wedge-shaped marks. You're not texting your friend. You're writing an important missive about grain yields to a neighboring city-state. You can practically hear the scraping sound, a soft S-C-R-O-P, S-C-R-O-P as you work. The tablet, once dried, will be your message, your letter. It's a very slow, very boring process, but it's the way things are done. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, go ahead and drop a comment with your location and local time. Begins in a place and time that feels almost like a myth. Ancient Mesopotamia, around 4,000 years ago. You're in the bustling city of Uruk, one of the world's very first cities. Instead, if a ruler, like the famous King Hammurabi of Babylon, needed to send a message to a distant provincial governor, he would first have a scribe write it down. The scribe, as we imagined, would etch the text onto a clay tablet using a cuneiform stylus. This wasn't some quick doodle. It was a formal, ritualized process. Imagine that. Your privacy protection was literally a second brick you had to smash. The delivery was the next challenge. No, he would dispatch a royal courier. This wasn't a casual job. These couriers were highly trusted, specially trained individuals, often members of the military. They were a bit like secret agents who also had to carry heavy, breakable bricks everywhere they went. They would travel on foot or sometimes by donkey, navigating the wild, unpredictable terrain between city-states. It was slow, it was dangerous, and it was certainly not a daily occurrence. The entire purpose of this rudimentary system was to keep a sprawling empire from collapsing in on itself. A king in Uruk needed to know what was happening in a distant city, and the only way to do that was through these couriers. This brings up a small historical debate. Historians still argue whether these early royal couriers were exclusively for state business, or if powerful, wealthy merchants sometimes paid them to carry personal messages. Imagine a merchant sitting on a pile of grain, thinking, I really need to tell my cousin in Kish that I'm coming to visit, but I'm not a king, so how do I do that? The answer might have been to bribe a royal courier, or maybe there were independent couriers for hire. Either way, the seed of the modern postal system, the idea that you, a regular person, but for now, it's still all about kings and royal decree, and the slow, heavy thump-thump of a courier carrying a brick-like letter down a dusty road as our Mesopotamian courier trudges off with his clay tablet. We fast forward a couple of thousand years and several hundred miles to the mighty Achaemenid Empire, ruled by the Persians. This is where things get a bit more organized and a lot more, well, fast. The Persians, under rulers like Cyrus the Great and Darius the First, understood that a massive, sprawling empire required a fast, reliable way to communicate. Their solution was the Royal Road, a network of meticulously maintained highways that stretched for thousands of miles, all the way from Susa to Sardis. It was the world's first superhighway for mail. Now you're a traveler on this road, maybe a merchant or an official. You're not in a dusty, windowless room anymore. You're out in the open, the sun on your back, the smell of horses and dust in the air. The road is wide and surprisingly smooth, and every few miles you see something new, a small, fortified building. This is a post house. Inside, there would be fresh horses and a new courier ready to take the message. The incoming courier would ride up, his horse likely exhausted, and hand off his dispatch to the fresh courier, who would immediately gallop off. This was a relay system. No single person rode the entire 1,600-mile length of the Royal Road. Instead, they worked in shifts. The speed was incredible for the time. The Greek historian Herodotus, who was generally pretty unimpressed with anyone who wasn't Greek, wrote about the Persian system with genuine admiration. He said, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays." That phrase, a slightly sanitized version of it anyway, still appears on the New York City General Post Office today, which is a quirky and slightly ironic little historical tidbit. The Persians weren't just fast, they were also efficient. The couriers were known as pigeons, and they were highly trained professionals, dedicated to their craft. They knew the roads, the safe houses, and the relay points. You weren't going to get some lazy teenager on a tired camel. You were getting the best of the best, and they were ready to go at a moment's notice. The entire system was so well regarded that even other empires, like the Romans who came after them, took inspiration from the Persian model. Now, a lot of historians still argue whether the Angaria was truly a public postal service, or if it was strictly for royal and military communications. The consensus seems to be that it was almost entirely for the king's business, delivering royal edicts, troop movements, and tax records. But we can imagine a scenario where a particularly wealthy governor, wanting to get a message to the king quickly, might have found a way to borrow the service. Or maybe they just handed their own courier a bag of gold and said, "Just try to keep up with the Persians, all right?" This transition from the slow, personal delivery of a single royal courier to a large-scale, systematic relay network is a pivotal moment in the history of communication. It's the moment when the idea of mail delivery moves from a one-off task to a piece of national infrastructure. The Royal Road wasn't just for messages. It also facilitated trade, troop movements, and a sense of unity across the vast, diverse empire. But for our purposes, it was a gigantic, multi-thousand-mile-long envelope, and the couriers were the first true professional mailmen, running a system that was far more sophisticated than anything that had come before. It was a mundane story, sure, but the very act of making something so mundane, like sending a letter fast and reliable, was in itself a revolutionary thing. So, you've seen the Persians set the gold standard for long-distance mail with their horse relays. Now, we're going to pivot to their great successors, the Romans. If the Persians were the innovators, the Romans were the master builders. They didn't just create a road system, they created an entire postal infrastructure that would become the blueprint for centuries to come. You're no longer a courier on a royal highway. You're an official, perhaps, traveling along a stone-paved road that feels surprisingly smooth under your sandals. The air is warm, the sun is high, and you can hear the faint jingling of a harness in the distance. This is the cursus, publicus, or the public course, Rome's official state-run courier service. The cursus publicus was established by Emperor Augustus, and it was a marvel of organization. The system was designed to handle official messages, decrees, and troop movements across an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. The Roman road network, famous for its straight lines and solid construction, was the backbone of this system. Along these roads, at regular intervals, were mansionese, or resting places, and mutations, or changing places. These weren't just random inns. They were state-sanctioned way stations. At a mutatio, a courier could swap out his tired horse for a fresh one, grab a quick bite, and be on his way in a matter of minutes. At a mansio, they could spend the night, their lodging and food provided by the state. It was an incredibly efficient system, designed to move messages with almost unbelievable speed. A message could travel about 50 miles in a day, which might not sound like much, but for the time, it was revolutionary. To put that in perspective, in the Middle Ages, the same distance might have taken a week. Now, a fun little quirky tidbit about this system. The cursus publicus was incredibly expensive to maintain. The costs were levied on the local communities where the mansionese and mutations were located. This meant that a local town might be burdened with the cost of feeding and housing a stream of couriers, even if the town itself never received any official state mail. It was a classic case of imperial efficiency at the expense of local economies, and it led to all sorts of attempts to cheat the system. Sometimes, local officials would try to pass off a private message as a public one to avoid paying, or they would claim that their horses were too sick to carry the couriers. The Romans, in their typical fashion, had laws against this sort of thing, but historians still argue whether they were actually effective. It's an interesting little debate because it shows the tension between the top-down needs of an empire and the bottom-up resistance of the people who had to pay for it. The couriers themselves were known as viators, or travelers. They were not just messengers. They were also a kind of information network for the emperor. They would carry official documents, yes, but they also acted as the eyes and ears of the state, reporting back on local events, disturbances, or anything that might be of interest to the powers in Rome. They were a bit like a combination of a UPI agent, which is a mildly amusing thought. The system was so reliable and so pervasive that it even carried more than just letters. High-ranking officials would use it to travel, and the emperor's personal messengers, a class of officials called agentis in rebus, used it to great effect. They were the ultimate VIPs of the Roman postal service. The cursus publicus wasn't a system for ordinary people to send letters to their friends. That would have been an entirely different and much slower affair. No, this was a system built for power, for control, and for keeping an empire running smoothly. So next time you see a statue of a Roman emperor, just remember that behind all the marble and togas, there was an incredibly complex network of roads and way stations, all working to get his mail to the right place. It's the kind of quietly organized history that's perfect for settling the mind. While the Romans were perfecting their road systems in the West, something entirely different was happening across the Atlantic. In the lush, green jungles of Mesoamerica, we're moving from a world of horses and stone-paved roads to a world of human endurance and carefully knotted cords. Imagine you're a royal messenger in the great Maya civilization, sometime around the 8th century. You're not wearing a toga. You're wearing a loincloth, and your feet are bare. You're not carrying a scroll. You're carrying a small, beautifully crafted object made of cords with little knots in them. The air is humid and thick with the sound of insects and birds, and the path you're on is narrow and winding, overgrown with lush vegetation. Your job is to get a message from one city to another, and you have to do it by running. This is the Maya mail system. The Maya didn't have a widespread state-run postal network like the Romans or the Persians. They didn't need one in the same way. Their cities, while grand, were often located in dense jungle. And the sheer logistics of building and maintaining a vast road network was probably more trouble than it was worth. Instead, they relied on a system of professional runners. These were not just random people. They were highly trained athletes who knew the jungle paths like the back of their hand. They would carry messages in a variety of forms, but perhaps the most interesting were the quipu, a system of knotted cords. Now, a quick aside. Historians still argue whether the Maya used quipu or if they were exclusively an Incan invention. But the concept is what's important. Here, messages weren't always written down in a linear, readable form. The knots represented numbers, or dates, or perhaps more complex ideas that we're still trying to understand. It was a kind of tactile, three-dimensional message. So, you're our Maya runner. You're not running in a straight line on a smooth road. You're navigating a winding path through the jungle, leaping over roots, ducking under vines, and listening to the rustle of unseen animals in the undergrowth. You're a human mail carrier, a living, breathing letter. It was a perilous journey, and it took a special kind of person to do it. But it was also a great source of pride. You were the fastest, the most reliable, and the one who connected the great cities. The entire system was based on a simple principle: human relays. A runner from one city would run to a small way station on the outskirts of another city, hand off the message to a fresh runner, and then rest before making the return journey. It was a brilliant solution to a very difficult problem, and it shows that the idea of a postal system is something that developed independently in cultures all over the world, even in places without the wheel or domesticated pack animals. The Maya's use of human runners is a quirky little tidbit that highlights the ingenuity of ancient cultures. While the Romans were all about infrastructure and logistics, the Maya were all about pure human effort and training. It's a bit like the difference between building a supercomputer to do a math problem versus training a person to do it in their head really, really fast. Both get the job done, but one is a lot more personal. The fact that the Maya system worked at all is a testament to the skill and endurance of these messengers. Their mail was a quiet, almost secret thing, a whisper through the jungle rather than a loud gallop down a stone road. It's a calming thought, isn't it? The quiet, determined effort of a person running with a purpose, with a message in their hand, through a world that is completely indifferent to their mission. It's a very different kind of history. One that feels less like a grand parade and more like a gentle, steady march. And for our purposes tonight, that's just perfect. From the humid, green jungles of the Maya, we now travel south, high into the Andes Mountains of ancient South America. Here, on dizzying high-altitude trails, an even more specialized form of human-powered mail delivery was at work. We're talking about the Incan chasqui, a system that was so efficient and so fast that it could reportedly get fresh fish from the coast to the emperor's table in the capital of Cusco, hundreds of miles away, in a matter of a single day. Imagine that. This wasn't just a simple messaging system. It was a human supply chain, a fresh food delivery service, and an information network all rolled into one, powered by the incredible endurance of its runners. You're a chasqui runner now. The air is thin and cold, and the sun feels closer, more intense. You're standing at a small stone hut called a tampu on a winding mountain trail. You're wearing nothing but a simple tunic and sandals, and you're waiting. In the distance, you see a small figure running toward you, a puff of dust following behind them. The figure gets closer, and you can make out the distinctive headband and the bag they carry. It's another chasqui. As they approach, they don't stop. They run right past you, calling out the message as they go. This is a crucial, quirky tidbit. The exchange was often done on the run, without breaking stride. The incoming runner would shout the message to you. You'd memorize it, and then you'd take off immediately in the opposite direction, ready to relay it to the next chasqui at the next tampu. It was a continuous relay race, a human version of the Roman horse system, but in a far more challenging and beautiful landscape. The messages themselves were fascinating. They weren't written on scrolls or clay tablets, because the Inca didn't have a written language in the way we understand it. Instead, they used the quipu, the same knotted cord device we briefly mentioned with the Maya. These quipu were complex mnemonic devices, with knots representing numbers, census data, or perhaps historical narratives. We still don't fully understand them, which is a big, open, scholarly debate. The chasqui would carry the quipu, but they were also trained to memorize and repeat verbal messages. So you, as a chasqui, had to have an incredible memory. You were a living, breathing hard drive, storing information as you ran. This was a system built on trust and human capacity, and it was the glue that held the vast Incan Empire together. The chasqui network was surprisingly well organized. The tampu way stations were strategically placed about a league apart, or roughly 2 to 3 miles a distance a runner could cover in about 15 minutes. This allowed for maximum speed and efficiency. The entire system was so reliable that the Inca emperor could send an order to a distant part of his empire and know that it would be carried out quickly and accurately. The runners, who were drawn from all over the empire, were revered and well cared for. It was an honor to be a chasqui, and their endurance was legendary. It's a mild, soothing thought, isn't it? The quiet, repetitive rhythm of a runner's footsteps on a mountain path. A message passed from hand to hand, a living chain of communication across an impossibly grand landscape. It's a very different kind of history, one that speaks to human resilience rather than imperial power. And as the sun sets over the Andes, and our last chasqui finally reaches the end of his leg, we can appreciate the beauty and simplicity of a system that was, in its own way, just as effective as any road network. From the swift, silent runners of the Inca and the Maya, we now glide across the vast blue ocean to medieval Europe. Here, in the sleepy little towns, surrounded by thick forests and muddy roads, there was no great postal network. There were no royal couriers or professional runners. Instead, the primary source of news and official announcements was a person whose voice was, to put it mildly, less than quiet. We're talking about the town crier. Imagine you're a farmer, or a baker, or a wool merchant in a small village in, say, 12th century France. The rhythm of your life is slow, predictable, and very, very local. Your world extends only as far as your feet can comfortably carry you in a day. You don't get a newspaper. You don't have a phone. But you do need to know about the king's latest decree, or the new tax on grain, or maybe just that the miller has run out of flour. The person who brings you this news is the town crier. You hear the sound before you see the person. First, the rhythmic, loud ring-a-ling-ling of a brass handbell. It's a sound that cuts through the sleepy hum of village life and makes everyone stop what they're doing. Then, you see him. He's probably wearing a simple tunic, maybe a leather belt, and he has a serious, official look on his face. He'll stand in the town square, maybe on the steps of the church or in front of the local tavern. And he'll clear his throat, take a deep breath, and then shout, "Oh yes, oh yes," which is a very old French word that basically means listen, 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 listen. It's the medieval equivalent of an all-caps text message. And then he'll deliver his message. The crier's job was to be the human microphone for the government, the church, and the local lords. He would read out new laws, announce public notices, and sometimes he would even report on news from faraway lands, though that was a rare and special treat. This system was, of course, incredibly inefficient by modern standards. There was no two-way communication, no privacy, and no record of the message other than what people remembered. And yet, it was the primary method of communication for centuries. It's a quirky little fact that town criers were often exempt from certain taxes and punishments because they held such an important and public role. They were, in a way, untouchable. Historians still argue whether the town crier's job was a coveted position or a last resort for someone who couldn't do anything else. It seems like it would have required a good set of lungs and a whole lot of nerve, but maybe it wasn't as prestigious as it sounds. We can imagine the townspeople getting annoyed when a crier came to interrupt their afternoon nap with a loud, boring announcement about something they didn't really care about. The town crier also shows a broader shift in how messages were delivered. The great, organized postal systems of the ancient world had collapsed with the fall of empires. Now, in a decentralized, feudal world, communication had become local again. There were still private couriers for the very wealthy. Lord could send a letter to another lord via a trusted messenger on horseback. But for the average person, the town crier was the closest thing they had to a post office. It was a step back in terms of speed and efficiency, but a step forward in a sense of community. Everyone in the village heard the same message at the same time, whether they liked it or not. The information was delivered to the people rather than waiting for the people to come and get it. It's a very different model from our modern one, where we have to actively seek out the news. Back then, it came to you, whether you were ready for it or not. As the town crier's voice fades into the background of a sleepy medieval village, we turn our attention east to a world where communication was once again a matter of imperial precision and quiet efficiency. We're traveling to the early Islamic caliphate, a vast empire that stretched from Spain to India. Here, a sophisticated and remarkably fast postal system was born, a system known as the bird. The bird wasn't a product of haphazard evolution. It was a deliberate top-down creation of the Umayyad, and later, the Abbasid caliphates. The rulers understood, just as the Romans and Persians before them did, that a sprawling empire could only be controlled with a rapid flow of information. The word bird itself is a subject of a little historical debate. Some scholars believe it comes from the Latin viridis, meaning post horse, a nod to the Roman influence. Others argue it's a Persian word, meaning to cut off the tail of a horse. A peculiar little tidbit referring to the practice of marking a postal horse by cutting its tail so it could be easily identified. Either way, the system was a marvel of organization. It was based on a network of relay stations, spaced roughly 6 to 12 miles apart, where fresh horses were kept at the ready. A courier, or Sahib Albert, would gallop from one station to the next, handing off his dispatches to a new rider, much like the Persian Angaria. The speed was impressive, often allowing a message to travel over 100 miles in a single day. The system was so reliable that it was often used to carry more than just letters. High-ranking officials and dignitaries would use it for swift travel, and it even played a role in espionage, with postmasters acting as spies for the caliph. The most enchanting part of the bird, however, was its use of an unexpected delivery method: carrier pigeons. While horses were used for land routes, the caliphate also established a sophisticated pigeon post. Pigeons were faster than horses and could fly directly over treacherous terrain or large bodies of water. The Abbasid Caliph Al-Mu'tamid, for example, reportedly used pigeons to send messages from his capital to a distant city in just a few hours. This quirky fact highlights a quiet, beautiful aspect of ancient technology. Imagine a pigeon, a small, unassuming bird, carrying a tiny scroll tied to its leg, a silent, feathered messenger gliding through the sky with a message from an emperor. It's a very peaceful and soothing image, isn't it? The bird was more than just a mail service. It was the nervous system of the empire. It carried news of uprisings, reports on tax collection, and even simple, personal letters from the caliph to his generals. Historians still argue whether the system was used by the general public. While it was primarily for official business, the efficiency and scale of the bird likely inspired and influenced the development of private message delivery services in the region. A slow, quiet domino effect that would eventually lead to the kind of mail we know today. The bird shows us that the desire for fast, reliable communication is a fundamental human need, a need that transcended cultures and eras. It reminds us that even in a world so different from our own, the mundane act of sending and receiving a message was a vital part of daily life. From the sophisticated pigeon-powered system of the bird, we once again find ourselves on a vast, dusty plain, this time under the watchful, steely eye of the Mongol Empire. While the Romans and Islamic empires built their systems on fixed routes and permanent stations, the Mongols, under the fearsome leadership of Genghis Khan, developed a system that was all about speed, efficiency, and scale on a truly breathtaking level. We're talking about the Yam network. The word itself, yam, is a small, quirky tidbit, possibly derived from a Mongolian word meaning way or road. But its practical meaning was a relay system for messages and travelers that stretched across the entire Eurasian continent. Imagine you're a messenger in the 13th century. You're not just a courier, you're a yam rider, and you're riding a small, shaggy Mongol pony. The air is cold and a fierce wind is blowing. You're traversing a landscape that seems to stretch on forever, from the steppes of Central Asia to the plains of Hungary. What makes this journey possible is the yam system. At regular intervals, roughly every 15 to 20 miles, were small, manned relay stations called yam stations. These weren't permanent stone buildings like the Roman mansionese. They were often just simple wooden huts or yurts, but they were vital. At each station, fresh horses were waiting, saddled and ready to go. The incoming rider would gallop up, hand off the message or the imperial decree to a fresh rider, and that rider would immediately take off at full speed. There was no time to rest, no time to get comfortable. The entire purpose was to move as fast as humanly and equinely possible. It was the original no rest for the wicked mail service. The speed of the yam network was legendary. Marco Polo, the famous Venetian traveler, wrote about it with a mix of awe and disbelief. He claimed that a message could travel 200 miles in a day, which was an astonishing speed for the time. This was not a system for delivering personal letters. This was a tool of empire, used for moving military dispatches, imperial edicts, and tax records. The sheer scale and reach of the YAM network was unprecedented. It was a physical manifestation of the Mongol will to power, a network that connected a disparate, conquered world and held it together. The system was so effective that it was one of the key factors in the Mongol Empire's ability to govern such a massive territory. It allowed Genghis Khan and his successors to communicate with their generals and provincial governors faster than any other empire in history. Historians still argue about the exact number of stations and riders the YAM network employed. The estimates are huge, suggesting a system of thousands of riders and hundreds of stations, all working in a quiet, tireless rhythm to serve the empire. The YAM was a prime example of a top-down, state-controlled postal system, but one that was uniquely adapted to the nomadic lifestyle of the Mongols. It wasn't about building a permanent infrastructure. It was about creating a flexible, mobile network that could be expanded or contracted as the empire grew or shrank. It was a beautiful and, in its own way, very soothing example of efficiency. The sound of a horse galloping across the plains, a rider focused on a single mission, the quiet exchange at a relay station. It's all a very peaceful picture, one that shows us that even in a chaotic and violent era, the mundane act of delivering a letter was a highly organized and respected part of life. As the Mongol Empire's vast relay system begins to fade from view, we drift forward in time and shift our focus to a different kind of institution, the university. This might seem like a strange place for postal history, but in medieval Europe, where centralized states were still a fragmented mess, the scholars and students of burgeoning universities were the ones who saw a need for reliable communication. Imagine you're a student at the University of Bologna in the 13th century. You're far from home, and you need to send a letter to your family. The town crier is useless for this, and the few royal couriers that exist are only for the king's business. So what do? You create your own system. This is exactly what happened. The students and faculty at places like the University of Paris and the University of Bologna were often from distant regions, and they needed a way to correspond with their families and friends. They also needed to exchange scholarly papers and books, so they established their own private, student-run postal services. These services were known as the cursus academicus, a sort of academic version of the Roman cursus publicus, but on a much smaller scale and with a very different purpose. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history. Instead of being an imperial tool of control, the mail system was born out of a simple, personal need for connection and intellectual exchange. The system was surprisingly well organized. The universities appointed official messengers, often senior students or trusted clerks, who were known as viators or travelers, a familiar name, isn't it? These messengers would travel on horseback along a set route, carrying letters, money, and even small goods between the university and the major cities of Europe. The service was reliable enough that it was also used by merchants and other townspeople who found it much more trustworthy than a random private courier. This is where a small, open, scholarly debate pops up. Was this a system of private communication that accidentally became a public service? Or was it always intended to be a sort of unofficial town mail? The answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. But the fact that it was organized by a community of scholars rather than a king or an emperor is a fascinating detail. The university postal services were one of the first widespread, non-state-run mail systems in Europe. They were a slow but steady beat of communication in a world where news traveled mostly by word of mouth. A letter from Paris to Rome might take weeks, but at least you knew it would get there. The messengers themselves were a kind of living network, carrying not just letters, but also news and gossip from one city to another. They were the original social media, connecting a scattered community of intellectuals. This quiet, intellectual beginning of a postal service is a nice contrast to the loud, fast-paced imperial systems we've talked about. It's a testament to the fact that when a community has a need, it will find a way to meet it, even if it has to create a postal system from scratch. From the quiet academic corridors of medieval Europe, we now witness the birth of what will become the world's first great commercial postal enterprise. The fragmented, localized services of the universities and private couriers simply weren't enough to handle the growing needs of a connected trading world. Enter the Thurn under taxis family. This is where the story of the post starts to look a lot more like a business and a little less like an ad hoc arrangement. Imagine you're a merchant in 15th century Italy, or perhaps the Holy Roman Empire. The world is opening up, trade is booming, and you need to send a letter about a shipment of goods from Venice to Brussels. You can't wait for a royal courier, and the university messengers are too slow. Your solution: the taxis family. The taxis, a noble family with roots in Lombardy, began to organize a network of professional riders and relay stations in the late 15th century. They weren't just moving letters for a king. They were moving them for anyone who could pay. This was a revolutionary shift. It was the moment that mail delivery went from being a state-controlled monopoly to a private, for-profit enterprise. The taxis family saw a gap in the market, and, with the blessing of powerful rulers like Emperor Maximilian I, they created a system that was faster and more reliable than anything that had come before. Their network was called the Kaiserlich Reichspost, or Imperial Post, and it stretched across a vast swath of Europe, from the Netherlands to Italy, and from France to Austria. The system was a marvel of logistics. They used a combination of horseback riders, who would change horses at designated posts, and foot messengers for shorter distances. They had set routes, fixed prices, and a reputation for reliability. It was the original FedEx, in a way. The family, with its genius for organization and diplomacy, managed to secure exclusive contracts with various rulers, effectively giving them a monopoly on mail delivery in huge parts of Europe. This is where a small, quirky tidbit comes in. The name taxis is thought to be derived from the Italian word tasso, meaning badger, a reference to the family's symbol. But a more plausible theory is that it comes from the Latin word taxis, for a type of carriage, or a related word for a relay station. Historians still argue about the exact reasons for the family's success. Was it their unique genius for business, their political connections, or simply the fact that they were in the right place at the right time? It was probably a combination of all three. Their system was so efficient that it essentially became the standard for postal services in Europe for centuries. The taxis family single-handedly created the blueprint for what we now consider a modern postal system. They introduced the idea of fixed schedules, standardized prices, and a network of professionals dedicated to the single task of delivering mail. The very word taxi in some languages can be traced back to this family's name, a quiet nod to their legacy of swift, reliable movement. It's a very soothing thought, isn't it? The idea that from a small family business, the entire concept of mail as a service rather than just a royal decree, was born. As the taxi's family was busy weaving their commercial mail network across land, a different kind of postal system was quietly taking shape on the high seas. From the late 13th to the 17th centuries, a powerful commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns in northern Europe emerged, known as the Hanseatic League. These cities, which stretched from the Baltic to the North Sea, had one core purpose: trade. And for trade to flourish, communication was key. The Hanseatic League didn't have a single official state-run post office. Instead, they created their own informal, yet incredibly efficient, sea-based message network. Imagine you are a merchant in the Hanseatic city of Lübeck, Germany. In the year 1450, you've just received a shipment of herring from the coast of Norway, and you need to send a message to your business partner in the city of Bruges, in what is now Belgium, to let him know it's on the way. You don't go to a post office, you go down to the docks. There, you find a skipper whose ship is set to sail to Bruges. You hand him your letter, sealed with wax and a stamp bearing your personal merchant's mark, and you pay him a small fee. The skipper, who is also a member of the League, agrees to carry the letter. This was a system built on trust and mutual business interest. It was a kind of maritime handshake, a quiet, reassuring part of the business of the sea. This is a fun, quirky little tidbit. The Hanseatic League's message delivery system was so reliable that it was often used by local rulers and even the Pope, even though it was a private commercial network. It was more trustworthy than many of the official, disorganized systems of the time. The very concept of the Hanseatic League itself, a network of independent cities working together for a common economic goals, a quiet, subtle, historical lesson. It was a kind of proto-European union, and its communication network was the glue that held it together. The couriers were not professional riders, but sailors and ship captains who were just as comfortable with a letter as they were with a fishing net. Historians still argue about the exact mechanics of this system. Was it a formal agreement, or was it a more informal network of favors? It's likely a bit of both. The League's records show that they had rules and regulations for how goods and information were to be transported. But the actual process of handing a letter to a ship's captain was probably a lot less bureaucratic than our modern mail system. It was a quiet, watery version of the overland systems, a slow but steady pulse of information that connected distant ports and kept the wheels of commerce turning. So, while the taxi's family was galloping across the European continent, the Hanseatic League was sailing across the cold seas, each of them, in their own way, making the world a little smaller, a little more connected, and a little more boringly efficient. From the quiet, watery world of the Hanseatic League, we now jump forward to a land with wide open spaces and a need for speed that was uniquely American. We're talking about the Pony Express. This is a part of postal history that has been so romanticized in movies and books that it feels more like a myth than a reality. But for 18 glorious, dusty months, it was a very real, very impressive, and very boringly efficient way to get mail across a continent. Imagine you're a young rider in the year 1860. You're not a soldier or a noble. You're a civilian, and you're riding a horse that has been bred for one thing: speed. The air is dry and smells of sagebrush and dust. Your saddlebags contain a few letters, and your only goal is to get to the next station, a lonely wooden shack on the horizon, as fast as you can. The Pony Express was the brainchild of a freight company, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, who saw a need for faster communication between the East Coast and the booming settlements of California. The official U.S. Postal Service was slow and inefficient, and the telegraph hadn't yet stretched across the entire country. The solution was simple in concept: a continuous relay of riders on fast horses. It was a human chain that stretched for nearly 2,000 miles, from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. The riders were young, light, and fearless. They would ride about 75 to 100 miles in a day, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles at small relay stations. This is a quirky little tidbit. The riders were so dedicated that they were reportedly sworn in with a Bible and forbidden from using foul language or drinking. The speed of the Pony Express was a marvel. A letter that would have taken months to arrive by traditional means could get to its destination in as little as 10 days. The cost was exorbitant. A letter could cost up to $5, which was a huge sum at the time, but the speed and reliability were worth it for newspapers and businesses who needed to get news and information quickly. The service was a financial failure, however, and it was quickly made obsolete by the completion of the transcontinental telegraph line. The fact that it only existed for 18 months is a small, quietly ironic detail. It was a beautiful, daring solution to a problem that was already being solved by a better technology. Historians still argue about whether the Pony Express was a truly successful venture or just a spectacular marketing stunt by a struggling company. The truth is, it was both. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration of what was possible, and it captured the American imagination like no other postal service before or since. The stories of the brave, solitary riders galloping across the vast, empty landscapes are a powerful image. It's a very different kind of postal history, one that is less about bureaucratic systems and more about individual heroism and the human need for speed. And as the sound of the final hoofbeats of the Pony Express rider fades into the distance, we can appreciate its brief, beautiful, and ultimately boringly efficient life. As the dust from the last Pony Express rider settles, we arrive at a more familiar and perhaps even more mundane part of our story. We are in 18th century America, and the Postal Service isn't about heroic riders on galloping horses anymore. It's about careful, methodical organization. And its most important figure is a man you know for a lot of other things: Benjamin Franklin. Imagine you're a colonist in Philadelphia in the 1750s. You're not looking for a thrilling story. You're looking for a letter from your cousin in Boston, and you're hoping it gets there before you're too old to read it. Before Franklin, the American colonial postal system was, to put it mildly, a mess. It was slow, unreliable, and expensive. Mail was often just left at a tavern for anyone to pick up, a quirky little tidbit that highlights how informal things were. Benjamin Franklin, in his role as Joint Postmaster General for the British North American colonies, changed all that. He saw the post not just as a way to move letters, but as a tool for communication and unity. He was a methodical man, a printer and a thinker, and he brought that same sense of order to the postal service. He standardized postal routes, created a rate table for postage based on distance, and, most importantly, he made the service reliable. He personally traveled the main postal routes, which stretched from Virginia to New England, to survey and measure them. He also improved the speed of delivery by creating a system of relay riders, a concept we've seen before, but which he perfected for the American context. One of his biggest innovations was something we now take completely for granted: the postmark. Franklin introduced the use of a circular stamp that included the city of origin and the date. This might seem like a boring detail, but it was a revolutionary idea. It allowed people to track their letters and hold the postal service accountable. It's a very calm and rational solution to a chaotic problem, isn't it? This small act of organization transformed the mail from an unpredictable lottery into a predictable and reliable service. Historians still argue whether Franklin's motives were purely logistical, or if he saw the postal service as a way to create a sense of shared identity among the colonies, which would later be a key factor in the American Revolution. The truth is, it was probably both. Franklin's work made the American Postal Service profitable for the first time. He made it accessible and affordable for a wider range of people. The mundane act of sending and receiving a letter became a part of everyday life. The post office became a social center, a place where people gathered to hear the news and pick up their mail. It was a place of connection, a physical network that mirrored the growing intellectual and social networks of the colonies. So, next time you see a picture of Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a thunderstorm, just remember that he also quietly and methodically built the foundation for the postal system that we still use today. It's the kind of quiet, understated achievement that's perfect for a sleepy mind. Benjamin Franklin's improvements made the postal service reliable, but it was another, even more boring innovation that truly democratized it and made it accessible to everyone. We are in 1840s Victorian England, an era of top hats, steam engines, and a lot of very complex etiquette. And in this era, a man named Rowland Hill had a very simple and very radical idea: the postage stamp. Before the stamp, paying for mail was a complicated and confusing affair. The cost of a letter was usually paid by the recipient, not the sender, and the price varied wildly depending on how many pages were in the letter and how far it had traveled. Imagine a letter carrier coming to your door and demanding a handful of coins. You might not have the money, or you might just not want to pay. So you'd refuse the letter, and the carrier would have to take it all the way back. It was an incredibly inefficient and unreliable system. Rowland Hill, a teacher and postal reformer, proposed a single, uniform postage rate for all letters, regardless of distance. This was a revolutionary idea. The price would be paid by the sender, not the recipient, and the proof of payment would be a small, sticky piece of paper. This sticky paper, the world's first postage stamp, was called the penny black, and it was introduced in 1840. The name itself is a wonderfully straightforward, no-nonsense tidbit. It cost 1 penny, and it was black. It featured a portrait of the young Queen Victoria. For the first time, anyone could send a letter anywhere in the country for a fixed and affordable price. It was a democratic invention, one that gave ordinary people a voice and a way to connect with the world. The penny black was a runaway success, and other countries quickly followed suit, creating their own postage stamps. The stamps themselves were a form of miniature art, tiny little windows into the history and culture of a country. They were a source of national pride and a testament to a quiet, boring, but incredibly important piece of infrastructure. And here's a small, quirky fact. The penny black was so popular that people would often forge it, leading to the development of the red Maltese cross postmark, designed to make the stamp unusable for a second time. This simple stamp and its postmark gave birth to the entire field of philately, the study of postage stamps. which is a testament to how something so mundane can become a beloved hobby. Historians still argue about whether the postage stamp's primary impact was on commerce or on personal communication. The truth is, it was both. It made business easier, but it also allowed families to stay connected across long distances. It enabled the quiet, everyday stories of people's lives to be shared. The invention of the stamp is a great example of a technological innovation that was so simple, so elegant, and so useful that it changed the world in a profound, yet very boring and predictable way. It's the kind of invention that makes you feel a little sleepy just thinking about it, which is, of course, the point. With the postage stamp making mail delivery a simple, fixed-price affair, the next major hurdle was speed. We're moving into the 19th century, an era defined by a new kind of power and a new kind of sound. The rhythmic, powerful chug of the steam engine. The train wasn't just a new form of transportation, it was a revolution for the postal service. Imagine you're a postmaster in, say, Chicago in the 1860s. The Pony Express is a thing of the past, but the mail is still slow. A letter to New York might take a week or more to get there, but now you can put that mail on a train. The train moves faster than any horse, and it can carry a lot more. It was a perfectly logical and perfectly boring innovation. The first use of trains for mail delivery was in Britain in the 1830s, and it quickly spread to the United States. But a simple train ride wasn't enough. The mail still had to be sorted at a post office, which was a time-consuming process. The solution was the railway post office, ARPS-POD. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of postal history. An RPO was a special railway car, a moving post office, staffed by postal clerks. It was a brilliant, almost hypnotic act of efficiency. The RPOs were a complex and dangerous world. The clerks had to memorize thousands of postal routes and sorting schemes. They worked in a cramped, noisy, and often dangerous environment, with the train lurching and swaying as they worked. They had to be quick and precise. And here's a small, open, scholarly debate. Was the RPO system an efficient use of resources? Or was it a romanticized and ultimately dangerous way of doing something that could have been done more safely on the ground? While the system was highly effective, the working conditions were often harsh, and accidents were not uncommon. It connected cities and towns in a way that had never been possible before. It enabled businesses to operate on a national scale and allowed people to stay connected with their loved ones across great distances. The sound of a train whistle, once just a sign of progress, was now also the sound of a letter arriving, a message from home, a check from a distant business. It's a very calm and soothing thought, isn't it? The quiet, repetitive rhythm of a train on the tracks carrying a cargo of letters, each one a tiny story, a tiny piece of a life, all moving together toward their destination. As the trains chugged across continents, a different kind of mail service was taking place in the skies, though not in the way you might think. We're in Paris, in the year 1870, a city under siege by Prussian forces. The city is completely cut off from the outside world. No trains, no telegraph, no couriers can get in or out. The French government, desperate to communicate with the rest of the country, came up with a peculiar and elegant solution: the pigeon post of Paris. Imagine you're a Parisian, trapped within the city walls. The French government decided to use carrier pigeons to send messages out of the city. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history that shows the ingenuity of people under pressure. The messages weren't written on tiny scrolls, though they were photographed and reduced to microscopic size on thin film. This process, called microphotography, allowed a single pigeon to carry thousands of messages on a single trip. The messages were then projected onto a screen in a laboratory, magnified and transcribed by hand. It was a beautiful blend of ancient animal husbandry and cutting-edge 19th century technology. The pigeons were released from the city in hot air balloons, and they would fly to a designated location outside the city where the messages would be retrieved and sent on their way. The system was a great success. They were a symbol of hope and a lifeline for a city under siege. Historians still argue about the exact number of messages that were sent via pigeon post during the siege, but it's clear that it was a vital part of the city's communication network. The system also had a small and very sad side. Not all the pigeons made it. Some were shot down by the Prussians, a harsh reality of a gentle technology used for war. The pigeon post of Paris is a perfect example of how a very old idea using birds to carry messages was adapted to solve a very modern problem. It's a very different kind of postal history, one that is less about bureaucratic systems and more about human ingenuity and the quiet, persistent courage of a small bird. It's a calming image, isn't it? A city in chaos and a single determined pigeon flying high above the noise and the conflict, carrying a tiny film with a message that could change the course of a war. With the train making mail delivery faster and the postage stamp making it cheaper, a new and very mundane kind of mail began to flood the postal system. We're talking about mail order catalogs. Imagine you're a farmer in the American Midwest in the late 19th century. You live miles from the nearest town, and the local general store has a very limited selection of goods. You need a new plow, or a nice dress for your wife, or maybe a toy for your children. How do you get these things? You don't get in a car because there are none. You can't go to a big store because there isn't one. Your solution is the mail order catalog, a thick, glossy book filled with pages of every imaginable product. This is a quiet and unassuming little historical fact that changed the world. The first major mail order catalog was published by Montgomery Ward in 1872. It was a single-sheet price list, but it quickly grew into a massive catalog, and it was soon followed by another giant in the field, Sears, Roebuck and Company. These catalogs were a lifeline for rural America. They offered a wide variety of goods at a lower price than a local store, and they offered a way for people to buy things that simply weren't available in their small towns. The entire system was built on the back of the newly efficient postal service. The mail carrier, once just a person who delivered letters, now became a kind of mobile department store. The mail carrier brought not just news and letters, but also a sense of connection to the wider world. The mail order catalog is a quiet example of a technology, in this case, the postal system, enabling a social and economic revolution. It democratized consumption, giving people in rural areas the same access to goods as people in cities. This leads to a mild, open, scholarly debate. Were the mail order catalogs a force for good, connecting people and providing them with goods, or were they a force for homogenizing culture and undermining local economies? The answer is probably both, and it's a question that continues to be relevant today with the rise of online shopping. It's a way to move goods, ideas, and a way to connect people to a larger world. So next time you see a package on your doorstep, remember that it's the very, very distant descendant of a thick, glossy catalog, a long list of goods, and a quiet, patient mail carrier. From the quiet chug of a railway post office, we now turn our gaze to the skies. It's the early 20th century, and a new technology is captivating the world: the airplane. And as soon as the first flimsy biplanes took to the air, people began to wonder if they could carry mail. The answer, of course, was yes. This is the story of the first airmail flights, a part of postal history that was as thrilling as it was dangerous, and as thrilling as it was, in its own way, mundane. Imagine you are a pilot in, say, 1918. You're not a dashing hero. You're a mail carrier. Your plane is made of wood and canvas, and the wind whistles past your goggles. Your cargo isn't bombs or soldiers. It's a bag of letters, a small, boring cargo in a great new technology. The first official airmail flight was in the United States in 1918, a route between Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York. The first pilot, a man named George L. Boyle, got lost on his very first flight and landed in a field in Maryland. A very human and very amusing beginning to a great innovation. But the service quickly got better. The pilots, often World War I veterans, were fearless and skilled. They flew through all kinds of weather, navigating by following railroad tracks and rivers. A wonderfully quirky little tidbit that shows how early aviation was still tied to the ground. The early airmail routes were not just a way to move letters. They were a way to prove that aviation was a viable form of transportation. It was a kind of a public relations campaign for the entire aviation industry. The danger was a real part of the job. The planes were unreliable, and the weather was unpredictable. Pilots often had to fly by the seat of their pants, with no radio or navigation aids. Yet they did it, and they did it with a quiet, professional dedication. This leads to a small, open, scholarly debate. Was the development of airmail a product of natural technological progress? Or was it a government-subsidized project designed to create a commercial aviation industry? The answer is probably both. The government saw the potential, and they were willing to invest in it, but it was the quiet, determined bravery of the pilots that made it all work. Airmail was incredibly fast. A letter that would have taken days to travel by train could now get there in a matter of hours. It was a revolution in speed, a quiet and efficient one. The sound of an airplane's engine, once a curious and strange sound, was now the sound of a letter arriving, a message from far away, a connection to a distant place. It's a very peaceful and calming thought, isn't it? The idea of a pilot all alone in the sky with nothing but a sack of letters. All of them tiny stories, tiny pieces of a life, all moving together toward their destination. As the airplane was conquering the skies, a more peculiar and far more hidden form of mail delivery was being developed deep beneath the bustling streets of major cities. We're talking about pneumatic tubes. This is a part of postal history that feels like something out of a futuristic science fiction novel, but it was, in fact, a very real and very boringly efficient part of the postal system in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Imagine you're a post office clerk in New York City in the year 1900. You're not putting a letter on a train or a plane. You're putting a letter into a small canister, a metal cylinder, and you're pushing a button. With a soft whoosh, the canister is sucked into a tube, and a moment later, it's hurtling toward its destination at 30 miles per hour, powered by compressed air. This is the pneumatic mail. The system was first used in London in the 1860s, and it quickly spread to other cities, including Paris, Berlin, and New York. The system was a network of underground tubes, usually about 8 inches in diameter, that connected major post offices and government buildings. The mail was placed into the canisters, and the canisters were sent to their destination using a combination of compressed air and a vacuum. It was a perfect and perfectly quiet solution to a very mundane problem: how to move mail quickly and efficiently through a crowded city without having to deal with traffic. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history. The pneumatic tube system was incredibly fast and reliable. A letter could travel from one end of Manhattan to the other in a matter of minutes, a speed that was impossible with a horse and carriage. It was a very calm and logical system, one that was hidden from the public eye, but which was vital to the smooth functioning of the city. The system was so efficient that it was even used to send small packages and money. This leads to a small, open, scholarly debate. Was the pneumatic tube system an elegant, if costly, solution to a logistical problem? Or was it a romanticized over-engineering that was destined to be replaced by cheaper and more flexible technologies? While the system was highly effective, the cost of building and maintaining it was enormous. The pneumatic tubes were eventually made obsolete by the advent of the automobile and the development of cheaper and more flexible forms of transportation. But for a few short decades, they were a quiet, invisible network, a secret world of mail delivery that was humming away beneath our feet. The sound of a pneumatic tube is a soft whoosh, a sound that is a perfect metaphor for this part of postal history: fast, efficient, and almost completely silent. It's a very peaceful and soothing thought, isn't it? The idea of a letter, a small story, a small piece of a life, being sucked into a tube and whisked away to its destination, all in the blink of an eye. While pneumatic tubes were whooshing beneath the streets, a far stranger and more short-lived postal experiment was being tried, not on land or in the air, but under the sea. This is a bizarre and wonderfully obscure part of postal history: mail delivery by submarine. Imagine you are a German naval officer in 1916. World War I is raging, and a British naval blockade has completely cut off your country's access to international trade. You need to get messages and valuable cargo things like medical supplies and industrial materials to America. Your solution: a submarine. Not a warship, but a cargo submarine. A vessel designed to carry goods, not torpedoes. This is where a very serious and very mundane story begins. The German Navy built 2 large cargo submarines, the Deutschland and the Bremen. Their purpose was to run the blockade, delivering goods and, yes, mail. The Deutschland, in 1916, became the first ever submarine to cross the Atlantic with a non-military cargo. It carried 750 tons of goods and, most importantly, a mailbag filled with letters from German citizens to their American relatives. The journey was slow, dangerous, and incredibly boring. The crew spent weeks underwater, in cramped, smelly, in claustrophobic conditions. Their job wasn't to fight. It was to transport goods and mail, a quiet, almost domestic mission in the middle of a global conflict. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history. The Deutschland successfully completed its voyage, and its mailbag was delivered to a post office in Baltimore, Maryland, where it caused a minor sensation. It was a victory for both the German war effort and for the postal system, a proof of concept that mail could be delivered in a way that was completely unthinkable just a few years before. The second submarine, the Bremen, disappeared on its voyage, a harsh reminder of the dangers of the job. This leads to a mild, open, scholarly debate. Was the cargo submarine a viable new form of transportation? Or was it a desperate one-off solution born out of wartime necessity? The truth is, it was a little bit of both. It was a desperate measure that, in its own weird way, proved that the human need for communication is so powerful that it will find a way to overcome any obstacle, even a naval blockade. The story of the mail-carrying submarines is a great example of how a military technology can be adapted for a peaceful purpose. It's a very different kind of postal history, one that is less about bureaucratic efficiency and more about human ingenuity and determination. The thought of a mailbag sitting in a small, cramped submarine, moving slowly and quietly through the dark waters of the Atlantic, is a very peaceful and calming one, isn't it? It's a quiet testament to the fact that even in the most chaotic of times, a letter, a small piece of a life, will find a way to get to its destination. From the fascinating, if short-lived world of submarine mail, we now turn our attention to an object so common, so mundane, that you probably never even think about it: the mailbox. The story of the mailbox is a quiet and surprisingly contentious part of postal history. For centuries, mail was a very personal and very public affair. It was handed directly from the carrier to the recipient, or it was left at a post office for the recipient to pick up. But as the volume of mail grew, this system became inefficient. The mail carrier was spending too much time waiting for people to answer the door, and the post office was getting crowded. The solution, of course, was to leave the mail in a box. But who should own the box, and where should it be placed? This is where the debate began. Imagine you're a postmaster in the mid-19th century. You've got a new idea. You'll ask people to put a box on their porch, and your carriers will just drop the mail in and move on. It's a very logical, very boring idea, but a lot of people were against it. They argued that it was an invasion of their privacy. They worried that their mail would be stolen. They believed that the personal hand-to-hand delivery of a letter was an important part of the ritual of communication. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history. The very first mailboxes were often just a slot in a door, a small, unassuming opening that was a kind of a compromise between personal delivery and a public drop-off. But the U.S. Postal Service wanted a more standardized solution. The official, standardized mailbox was first introduced in the United States in the 1890s with the advent of rural free delivery. The idea was simple. If the post office was going to deliver mail to a rural area, it needed a standardized place to put it. The mailbox was born, but it was not without its controversies. This leads to a mild, open, scholarly debate. Was the mailbox a benevolent invention designed to make life easier for people? Or was it a way for the post office to push the responsibility and cost of providing a secure delivery point onto the public? The truth is, it was probably a little of both. It was a perfect example of a public service and a private citizen working together, often with some friction, to solve a mundane logistical problem. The mailbox, in its quiet, unassuming way, changed the nature of communication. It made mail delivery a constant, passive thing, a quiet ritual that happens every day without fanfare. The sound of a mail truck stopping at your door, the soft clink of a letter hitting the bottom of the box. These are the quiet, everyday sounds of a system that has been refined and perfected over centuries. It's a very peaceful and calming thought, isn't it? The idea of a small metal box standing there in the sun and rain, waiting patiently for a letter, a small story, a small piece of a life, all of it a testament to the quiet, determined efficiency of a very boring system. From the humble mailbox, we now turn our attention to one of the weirdest and most spectacular failures in American postal history, the U.S. Camel Corps. Imagine you are an army officer in the American Southwest in the 1850s. The landscape is a vast, empty desert of sand, rock, and cactus. The roads are terrible, and your horses and mules are struggling to carry supplies and mail across the arid terrain. You're looking for a better way to do it. The solution, proposed by Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, was a brilliant and very strange one: camels. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history that shows how a good idea can be a terrible one in practice. In 1856, the U.S. government purchased 33 camels and brought them to Texas. The idea was that camels, with their ability to carry huge loads and travel for long distances without water, would be perfect for carrying mail and supplies across the desert. The camels, with their quiet, shuffling gait, were put to work immediately. They were surprisingly good at the job. They could carry more than a horse or a mule. They were more durable in the desert heat, and they were, in their own way, quite efficient. They were a kind of living, breathing, and very boringly efficient mail truck. This is a small, quirky fact. The camels were so quiet and so strange that they often spooked the horses and mules of other travelers, causing all sorts of chaos. The Camel Corps was, in a logistical sense, a success. The camels proved that they could do the job, but the project was a total and complete failure. Why? For a number of very mundane reasons. The American horses and mules hated the camels. They would panic and run away at the sight and smell of them. The camel handlers, who were often from the Middle East, were not trusted by the American soldiers. And most importantly, the project was a product of the pre-Civil War era. When the Civil War broke out, the project was abandoned, and the camels were sold off to circuses, zoos, and private owners. This leads to a mild, open, scholarly debate. Was the failure of the Camel Corps a result of its inherent flaws, or was it a victim of a historical moment that simply moved on without it? The truth is, it was a little of both. It was a good idea in a vacuum, but in the real world, it simply didn't work. The story of the U.S. Camel Corps is a great example of how a very serious and very logical solution to a mundane problem can be a total flop. It shows us that postal history is not just about efficiency and progress. It's also about human error, social conflict, and a lot of very strange and beautiful animals. The thought of a camel, a living piece of the Middle East, shuffling quietly across the American desert with a sack of letters on its back, is a very peaceful and calming one, isn't it? It's a quiet testament to the fact that even the most bizarre of ideas can find their way into the history of mail. From the quiet shuffling of camels, we now look at a far more significant and far more boringly impactful part of postal history: the post office as a force for social change. For most of our story, the postal service has been a tool of empires or a private business, but in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it became something new, a tool for connecting people, for creating communities, and for democratizing information. The post office was more than just a place to send a letter. It was the nerve center of a town, a place where people gathered, a place where news was exchanged, and a place where a small, very quiet revolution was taking place. Imagine you're a recent immigrant in a large American city in the year 1910. You're far from home and you don't speak the language. The world feels big and confusing, but you know that at the post office there is a letter waiting for you from your family, a small piece of home in a foreign land. The post office provided a vital service for immigrant communities, allowing them to stay connected with their families and friends back home. The post office was also a place where you could learn about your new country. It was a place where you could find a job, a place where you could get a letter from a distant relative, a place where you could feel a little less alone. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history. The post office was also a place of social integration. It was a place where people from different walks of life, from different social classes, and from different ethnic backgrounds would come together. It was a kind of a great equalizer, a place where everyone was a customer and everyone was treated with the same quiet, professional respect. The post office, in its own way, was a quiet, unassuming force for social progress. This leads to a mild, open, scholarly debate. Was the post office a truly benevolent institution, or was it a tool of assimilation designed to force people to conform to a new culture? The truth is, it was probably a little of both. It was a place where people could hold on to their old lives, and a place where they could begin to build their new ones. The post office was also a quiet force for economic change. It allowed small businesses to reach a national market, and it allowed farmers to sell their goods to people in cities. It was the original e-commerce platform, a system that connected producers and consumers across vast distances. The sound of a stamp being licked and placed on a letter, the quiet thud of a letter being dropped into a mailbox, these are the quiet, everyday sounds of a system that changed the world in a profound and very boring way. It's a very peaceful and calming thought, isn't it? The idea of a place, a simple building in a quiet town, that was a kind of a crossroads for a nation, a place where all the stories, all the dreams, and all the fears of a people were gathered and sent on their way. As the postal service became a force for social change, it also became a target for a new and very annoying kind of mail, junk mail. This is a part of our story that you are probably very familiar with. The term junk mail itself is a bit of a modern invention, but the practice is as old as the postal system itself. The very first mail was a kind of junk mail, royal edicts, and government propaganda. But as the postal system became more accessible, so did the ability to send unwanted mail. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history that shows how a good idea can have a very, very boring downside. The history of junk mail is the history of the postal service itself. As soon as businesses realized they could use the postal system to reach a wide audience, they began to flood the system with advertisements. In the 19th century, with the invention of the postage stamp and the development of the train, the volume of mail skyrocketed. Much of this new mail was commercial. Catalogs, flyers, and advertisements for everything from patent medicines to farm equipment began to fill the mailbags. The post office, in its quiet, professional way, was a part of this. It was a kind of a neutral party, delivering whatever was sent its way as long as the postage was paid. This leads to a mild, open, scholarly debate. Was the postal service, in its effort to be a neutral carrier, also a kind of a co-conspirator in the rise of junk mail? The truth is, it was probably a little of both. It was a service that was designed to be used, and it was used by everyone, for good and for ill. Junk mail is a great example of how a mundane technology can be used for purposes that are not always what was intended. The postal system was created to connect people, to send messages, and to deliver important documents. But it was also used to sell things, to advertise, and to fill our mailboxes with things we don't want. The sound of a letter carrier, once a symbol of hope, became a symbol of annoyance. The sound of a thud in the mailbox, once a sign of a letter, became a sign of a bill or an advertisement. It's a very peaceful and calming thought, isn't it? The idea that even in a world of progress, a very old and very boring problem continues to plague us. And as you fall asleep, you can rest assured that even in the history of the mail, there are things to worry about. As the postal system became more complex and the volume of mail grew to astronomical levels, a new kind of a quiet and very boring job was created. The manual mail sorter. We're talking about a person, a human being, whose sole job was to stand in a giant room and sort letters into a series of small, unlabeled holes. Imagine you're a postal worker in a large city in the mid-20th century. The air is filled with the soft rustle of paper and the low hum of voices. You're standing in front of a long wooden rack, a kind of giant honeycomb, and you're holding a stack of envelopes. Your eyes are scanning, your hands are moving, and your mind is a blur of street names, zip codes, and city abbreviations. It's a very repetitive, very methodical, and very, very boring job. The manual sorting system was a marvel of human efficiency. A good sorter could sort thousands of letters in an hour. They had to memorize the entire city's street layout, its zip codes, and the location of every mail route. It was a kind of a mental atlas, a quiet and brilliant feat of memory, and a testament to the power of the human brain. This is a wonderfully quirky little tidbit of history. The best sorters were revered, a kind of an unsung hero of the postal system, and their skills were often passed down from one generation to the next. But the manual sorter's days were numbered. In the mid-20th century, with the development of automation and the computer, the post office began to replace the human sorter with a machine. The machines could sort faster, and they could work 24 hours a day, and they didn't require a salary or a coffee break. The sound of the postal sorting room began to change. The soft rustle of paper and the low hum of voices were replaced by the mechanical clatter of a machine, the hypnotic rhythm of an automated sorter. This leads to a mild, open, scholarly debate. Was the automation of the postal system a triumph of progress, or was it a quiet and very sad end to a very human job? The truth is, it was a little of both. It was a step forward in efficiency, but it was also a step away from a very human and very beautiful part of the postal system. The end of the manual sorter is a quiet and very fitting way to end this part of our story. It's a reminder that even the most boring and mundane of jobs have a history, and even the most efficient of technologies can't completely replace the quiet, determined, and very human work of a person doing their job. The quiet, mechanical rhythm of the automated sorter hummed on, but a new and even quieter revolution was just beginning. We are in the late 20th century, and the world is getting smaller. The postal system, with its long history of clay tablets, horse relays, and steam-powered trains, is about to face its biggest challenge yet. We're talking about the quiet transition to email. This is a part of our story that you have probably lived through yourself. a subtle, almost unnoticeable shift that changed the way we communicate forever. Imagine you're a young person in the 1990s. You've just gotten a computer and a new technology called electronic mail or email has been invented. You don't have to write a letter by hand. You don't have to put a stamp on it. You don't have to walk to the mailbox. You just type a message, press a button, and it's sent almost instantly across the world. The first email was sent in 1971, a very boring and very technical message that simply said, "Courtier." But it was a beginning, a seed that would grow into a tree that would eventually overshadow the entire postal system. The early days of email were a bit clunky, with dial-up modems and slow connections, but the speed and convenience were undeniable. It was a kind of a magic, a way to send a message without the physical limitations of the real world. This leads to a mild, open, scholarly debate. Was the rise of email a natural result of technological progress, or was it a product of a social need for faster, more immediate communication? The answer is probably both. The technology was ready, and the people were ready for it. The transition to email was not a dramatic event. There were no riots in the streets. There were no angry mobs. There was just a quiet, slow shift. We began to send fewer letters and more emails. We began to buy fewer stamps and to type more messages. The postal service, in its quiet, professional way, began to adapt. It began to focus more on packages and less on letters. It began to see itself not as a letter carrier, but as a logistics company. The sound of a letter dropping in a mailbox became less common, replaced by the soft ping of a new message notification. The rise of email is a great example of how a very old and very human need, the need to communicate, was met by a new and very different technology. It's a quiet reminder that the story of mail is not just a story of physical objects, but a story of ideas and how those ideas move through the world as we stand at the precipice of the digital age. With our email inboxes and our instant messages, let's take a final step back. Let's look at a single, final, imaginary letter. We'll trace its journey, not through time, but through space. A quiet, repetitive journey from one hand to another. A journey that is, in its own way, a microcosm of our entire story. Imagine this letter is a small, white envelope. It's a bit crumpled, and the handwriting on the front is a little messy. It's a letter from a child to a grandparent, a simple message of love, and a small, hand-drawn picture of a dog. This is our final, very boring piece of history. The letter begins its journey in a small, red mailbox. It's dropped in by a small, hesitant hand, and with a soft clink, it falls to the bottom. The mailbox is a silent witness, a quiet and unassuming beginning. The letter is then picked up by a mail carrier, a person who is, in this moment, a modern-day courier, a living piece of a very old system. The carrier takes the letter to the post office, where it's placed in a large canvas bag, a kind of modern-day horse-drawn carriage. The bag is then put on a truck, a kind of modern-day train, and it begins its journey to a sorting center. At the sorting center, the letter is sorted by a machine, a kind of modern-day manual sorter, a brilliant mechanical brain that can read the zip code and place the letter in the right slot. The sound of the machine is a quiet, rhythmic hum, a sound that is both a symbol of progress and a quiet, almost sad reminder of the past. The letter is then put on a plane, a kind of modern-day airmail biplane. and it begins its long journey across the country. A tiny, insignificant piece of a large, roaring machine. When the plane lands, the letter is placed back on a truck, and it begins its final journey to its destination. It's carried by a new carrier, a new person, a new living piece of a very old system. The carrier walks up a driveway and places the letter in a mailbox, a quiet and unassuming end to its long, long journey. The grandparent opens the mailbox, and with a soft, quiet smile, they pull out the letter. They don't know the history of the mail. They don't know about the clay tablets, or the horse relays, or the steam engines. All they know is that a small, white envelope, a tiny piece of paper, has traveled all this way to bring them a message of love from a small, hesitant hand. That's the entire story of mail, isn't it? It's the story of a very old, very boring, and very beautiful human need to connect, to share, and to be a little less alone in this great big world. It's a quiet, slow, and very predictable story, and it's a perfect story for a sleepy mind. Now, as the screen fades to black and the words on the screen begin to blur, take a moment to feel the weight of this history. It's a history that is not about great battles or grand declarations. It's a history that is all about the small, quiet, and very persistent acts of people all over the world for thousands of years. It's the story of a simple letter finding its way home. You can imagine the quiet, determined footsteps of a Roman courier on a stone-paved road, or the soft, shuffling gait of a camel in the desert, or the rhythmic chug of a train on the tracks. Each of these sounds, each of these images, is a part of this great, quiet, and very beautiful story. The history of mail is a history of humanity, a history of our need to connect, a history of our most mundane and most beautiful acts. So, as you drift off, you can rest assured that even in the most boring parts of the world, there is a quiet and very beautiful story to be told. Sweet dreams.